Okay, so we've let the pilots run for about a little over a month here on the channel for This Movie Exists, and this will just be a breakdown and look over on how they did and what the response was to each one. Not a long video, not a complete overview of each uploaded episode as we prepare for getting the next one up, hopefully sooner than planned. As you'll see in the breakdown as it commences, initially from the reaction, the one that got the highest number count in terms of views, best numbers in terms of views straight away was Happily Ever After. That would normally suggest that the very next thing that we put right into production would be an animated episode, and that was the plan initially. One issue with that is that Happily Ever After also was one that got demonetized because I guess whoever the current rights holders are, I believe it's NBC Universal of that part of the Filmation library, was a little more aggressive on that than the others, so we've got to look further into making sure that doesn't happen in the future. Animation can be tricky on YouTube in terms of that for reviews. It's supposed to be under fair use, but it's really no use fighting it, unfortunately. That doesn't necessarily mean that the next episode won't be animated, just means that we've still got some tweaks to do on the approach, which is partly why we did 3 at once up front. The main takeaway, which you're probably going to get sick of me saying, but it's true overall, is that the rollout was really kind of an unqualified success as far as attempts that we've had at launching item. This is probably the best launch of something we've had since the channel went independent, at least since Really That Good, which was done as a side project to 2 other professional items. So this has been really encouraging. Thank you all so much. As ever, please keep circulating the episodes. We saw a pretty good bounce on the Patreon. I'd really love to see more of one. At this point, I know it's probably unrealistic to see that jump up to where it was when the show first went independent, when we first left The Escapists the first time, but at least getting significantly up from where we are now would be a big help in boosting production and also just getting those bills paid. But of course, nothing will help as much as getting more episodes into production on this end, which we are cooking towards shortly, along with reviews, episodes, everything else. So here comes the breakdown. See you on the other side. Thank you once again so much for helping to make this all possible.
But why?
Well, let's just say I like to fuck a lot.
Ginger, the very private eye. She gives a man-sized job a woman's touch.
So, right up front, I want to be clear here. No, I did not in fact plan to be dropping a Played for Laughs episode about a guy who made TV movies for tweens at a kids' cable channel in the mid-90s, having a previous life making almost porn movies in the same time frame that a very serious business documentary about child abuse at a different kids' cable channel would be hitting and making a huge deal in the media. I honestly hadn't been following the Quiet on the Set story that closely in terms of its release date, and by the time it was closing in, the actual video for this, Ginger, had already been made and uploaded well in advance and just waiting to go public on the channel, and I figured that going back and inserting some kind of tangential reference would feel more inappropriate than not doing anything about it at all in the first place. Apart from that, depending on whether you know me personally, where you came on board this ride, or when, this will probably be the most or least surprising thing here, but when I was drafting up the titles that had to be in the rotation for this series at all, what had to go into the launch episodes, Ginger was pretty much the only one that was always gonna be there. There was absolutely a scenario where if this was going to start with only 1 episode as pilot, this could have been it. Not because I'm a fan of the movies or the people involved or the genre of skeevy, violent, misogynist quasi-porn. I mean, I'm no Puritan gang, but I've got standards, but precisely because it's such a bizarre, grotesque relic that's also so specific to a time and place, but also so comically carried forward into the present. I was not exaggerating about my reaction to realizing this was the same Don Shane who was producing those Disney Channel movies. I really did recognize his name from learning about Ginger and its sequels back in the mid-90s when Grindhouse drive-in B-movie cult cinema boom was in full swing. I remember reading about them in the Psychotronic Movie Guide and old-time internet movie fandom sites like the Bad Movie Report and Stomp Tokyo, which are sort of only around as code ghosts now and whose creator critics are just kind of in the ether as far as I know, but Wow, gonna be a few edits on that one. So it kind of surprised me that this was less popular out of the three by the numbers wise, but more so in feedback. And to be clear, I'm not saying any negative or less enthusiastic feedback was upsetting, and I'm especially not looking to make anyone feel bad about that they really didn't want to watch something about this specific sort of movie or even hear about it. I get that. I don't take exception to it. I pretty much factor that response in as a given when I decide to put this sort of content out. The only question is how much. To be blunt about it, the cynic in me sincerely thought that Disney Channel movies were made by a former skin flick king was the kind of did-you-know attention hook that tends to be a bigger draw, so I have to wonder if maybe the gulf between the two things is actually so wide that it just doesn't register as that much of a thing anymore, since the 70s is basically the mythic ages of the past that may or may not have even existed to people young enough to have actually cared about High School Musical. And also, yeah, I can't discount that putting out sleazy backstory to cute tween cable TV from the 2000 content in the same period that everyone else was focused on quiet on set but played for funny was maybe not where the vibe was at right now. That can happen, and oh well, the dirty side of exploitation movies is a tough area because it encompasses a lot of really interesting, historically important parts of the genre, but because of the on-screen content, sometimes just the subject matter and also time marches on and things are just different. A couple of things on my want-to-do list that I'm still figuring out how to cover, not because I think I can't under YouTube guidelines or because I think cancel culture is a real thing, but because I think taste is a thing. But in the case of this particular piece, what spoke in Ginger's favor was that it wasn't just one thing, but the trilogy aspect. When you're looking backwards at some of these, what's most interesting is sometimes less the object itself, but the impact, and sometimes the impact is that this worked, and they just kept doing it. So whereas on its own, I probably could have gotten the same basic episode out of any dozen other trashy 70s sleaze movies in terms of if you're under 35 and don't seek this stuff out on your own, you might not know that the unfiltered, non-spoof versions of this era culture really was effect. What really makes it special, if no less unfortunate, is to me it has the same energy that makes the other famous good-bad movie icons like Ed Wood, James Nyan, or Tommy Wiseau stand out. That unique combination of tons of ambition and vision, sometimes even real creativity, but very little actual talent or skill manifesting through attempts at deeply cynical for-profit exercises where the drive to create and express something pokes through in weird but very compelling or at least entertaining ways. And in Ginger's case, the way it starts from the point of this gritty, grimy, gross movie about a private eye shooting and castrating drug dealers in Florida motels, and then somehow part 3 opens with the titles exploding over a James Bond orchestral theme and has State Department mission briefings and spy assassinations and gunfights and karate and evil counterpart version of the heroine. That's fascinating to me as a fact of this thing's existence, and I guess also kind of speaks to me personally as someone who was part of the every internet movie, game, TV, etc. reviewer deciding their sketch personas and cutaway gags needed to have internal mythology to become mini-movies trend in the 2000s. Sure. And that, along with these show off the full breadth of what I want to cover and push the edge of the content window aspects I outlined in the video itself, is why Ginger was in the launch. And I'm glad it was. I think it came together pretty well, apart from having to actually watch the movies again. It was fun to put together, and whereas always want the numbers to be higher because, you know, money, again, they all perform pretty well, and I'm also grateful for the full spectrum of feedback, whether you said just not for me or you found it interesting, funny, whatever. Doesn't mean I won't cover more trashy 70s sexploitation movies? No, but it's just probably not as the next first thing because momentum exists, but it's at least not the last we've seen of that general atmosphere in the near future, at least in terms of planning.
And what message do you bring me now? Your death.
And here was the second biggest surprise, and a happier one on my end, not because I was unhappy with the other 3 episodes, but because I was really glad of how this one came together, but also it was the one I was most thinking a YouTube audience just wouldn't really care about, maybe. And instead it did pretty well, second best showing at last count. Look, it's not to say that YouTube doesn't appreciate older movies, but demographics are a thing, and as audiences go, there are zones, sweet spots, and the YouTube algorithm spot for pre-1970 movies tends to skip over anything 50s that isn't retro kitsch, American Americana and everything 40s that is an ironic World War II propaganda art, and then jump all the way back to the silence because that's what gets referenced by indie games and analog horror stuff. 30s movies, not so much. And as noted in the episode, for much of his career in the sound era, pop culture thought of Cecil B. DeMille as old-fashioned throwback at the time. Like, his movies tended to be hits and sometimes win awards, but he was very much akin to a Michael Bay, Ridley and Tony Scott, pre-Schindler Spielberg, even Zack Snyder-esque figure. Like, his movies tended to be hits and sometimes win awards, but he was very much akin to a Michael Bay, Ridley and Tony Scott, pre-Schindler Spielberg, even Zack Snyder-esque figure, where critics often dismissed him as a hokey crowd-pleaser making expensive versions of corny old-time formula programmers, gussied-up cliffhanger serials or boys-own adventure stories with then-modern budgets and effects, which he, kinda was. But I thought this was an interesting one, and there's a few more in the same vein I'd like to cover because from my standpoint, it's fascinating that some of the biggest movies ever made at one point can just go out of fashion and people forget they were even a thing, even though the influence stays on. And I'm not only glad it came out, in my opinion, as well as it did, the feedback was really encouraging. I'm so glad people connected with this one because of the three, it's really the one I felt like on revisiting was the most surprising in terms of, actually, this is so much more interesting a movie than you expect it to be, and there's something teachable in terms of, look, I'm all about the now being better and the need to move forward, but if it wasn't also true that the before wasn't complicated, there wouldn't be any precedent that we were capable of moving forward in the first place. We have proof that there's no excuse for any filmmaker or artist of today to rest on their own previously established progressive laurels when it comes to personal growth on the issues of the day, when the same deeply flawed director who at one point thought nothing of casting Boris Karloff in Redface as an Indian war chief could also show an even hand to both sides of a Crusades movie. And plus the characters are interesting, it's technically proficient, and it's not the same classic black and white movie that you hear about all the time on TCM, all the time in film school. It has very nifty connections to modern movies with the Caddyshack thing, so I'm just really glad that I was able to make an episode out of this and the people were able to get into it. So this is exactly the sort of thing that I was envisioning that this show could be in its most, to use my favorite $1 million word, esoteric form. So I'm really glad people liked it.
Why, you're not the Seven Dwarfs. I should say not. But then, who are you? We're their cousins, the Seven Dwarf Elves.
And so here was basically the crowd favorite and also the one that got demonetized through Content ID claims. So gonna have to work on that by the current rights holders to this particular part of the Filmation library, which is irritating since this is technically the kind of review that's supposed to be covered by fair use, but good luck getting that reversed without making things worse instead. So please hit up the Patreon, guys, cause that is how this really gets paid for. In any case, I should have guessed that this would be one of the ones people would get way into since Disney connection, animation, princesses, had a nice grabby first weekend thumbnail, etc. And it was one of the first things I was looking at for the series, even though I wish we were able to get more actual earning off the video since, artistic achievement and all that is lovely, but I gotta eat and pay bills here. I was really happy with how this one came out, and I think it was a good exercise for how to do an episode on something that's pretty definitively not a good movie without just turning it into another let's make fun of a thing show that I feel like everyone's tired of. In this case, by just not doing or skipping over the more obvious, the animation isn't great, or the scene is dumb, or the screenplay is bad parts, and focusing on the production history up front and the parts of the actual movie that are sort of a little bit interesting, if either not fully achieved or effective in the intended way. That's the approach that works for me. The fact of it is, even if I've now lived more of my life post-digital and post-internet than pre, my formative experience with media in general, and this kind of media especially, was the analog world, where sometimes you just had to sit with these things and either find out if they were good or bad, or find the good in them by getting all the way through. There just wasn't much skimming around or pulling up the answer. And sometimes on your way to finding out whether it was worth your time, you realized it was worth it on a different level. And just by perusing my list of maybes for this series, it bears out that there's a lot on here that fits the bill of, this isn't great, but you should see it because it's interesting that someone did this. That's the way it goes. And that's true for this movie. Now, as for how it affects immediate plans, this one being the runaway success would tell me that I should probably do either that Filmation Pinocchio sequel or at least another weird cartoon right away, because clearly that's what the people want, but also monetization. So I can't for sure say which of the currently gestating follow-ups will hit next, but something is coming, hopefully sooner than you think. But for now, I'm really glad these did well all in their own right, because I'm overwhelmingly encouraged by the positive feedback, and all I can ask for or say is that it'd be great if people could just get even more eyeballs on these. In the meantime, thank you so much for making me feel like this was worth taking a swing on. I cannot wait to show you what's next. Please like, share, subscribe, check out the Patreon, get the Patreon out to your friends, and I'll see you with the next one.